It was a damp, colourless morning in the English countryside, the kind where mist clung to the hedgerows and the sound of boots on gravel echoed like distant thunder. Inside a fenced compound surrounded by barbed wire, a group of captured German officers stood quietly watching as a British supply truck rattled toward the gates. For weeks they had been here in a sprawling prisoner-of-war camp, known for its strict order and peculiar civility. They were far from home, stripped of rank and power, but treated under the rules of the Geneva Convention. The truck's tailgate dropped open, and a British sergeant began unloading boxes marked with a familiar emblem, the Red Cross. To the officers, the parcels looked like treasure: chests, cigarettes, tins of meat, powdered milk, soap, and then something none of them expected to see. Wrapped in paper, brown and silver, lay a row of chocolate bars. Real chocolate, not ersatz, not the bitter imitation paste they'd grown used to. In Germany, a few of the officers stared, speechless. One murmured to another half in disbelief. Chocolade? Impossible. They hadn't tasted real chocolate in years. To them it was a forgotten luxury, a relic of a world that no longer existed under Hitler's war economy. But here on a foggy English morning, the enemy handed it to them as if it were nothing more than an ordinary snack. That moment, simple, almost absurd, would haunt them. Because what they held wasn't just a bar of chocolate. It was proof of something far greater, a symbol of abundance, a symbol of power, and for these captured officers a taste of what it truly meant to be on the losing side of total war. But that wasn't the whole story. Because this little bar of chocolate wasn't a luxury in America, it was standard ration. The camp was typical of those spread across wartime Britain. Wooden huts laid out in neat rows, surrounded by double fences, watchtowers, and floodlights that turned the nights into a cold grey glow. It could have been any of them. Grisdale Hall in the Lake District, known as the U-boat officers' camp or Trent Park, the stately mansion outside London where captured generals were secretly recorded by British intelligence. Wherever it was, life inside followed the same rhythm. The day began with roll call, the clatter of boots, the bark of names. Then came breakfast, thin porridge or bread rationed to the ounce. Officers spent hours pacing the perimeter or sitting in makeshift classrooms pretending to plan their future careers. They held chess tournaments, wrote letters home, and tried to preserve the illusion of discipline. The British Guards treated them firmly but fairly. Under the Geneva Convention, officers were given certain privileges. No forced labour, regular mail, even newspapers. But food. Food was the one thing that defined every man's day. Then came the Red Cross parcels. They were like small miracles, issued weekly, packed with supplies from neutral Switzerland and often containing American goods. The sight of those boxes, arriving, sent a wave of excitement through the camp. They were unpacked under watchful eyes, and each man received his share: canned corned beef, cheese, cigarettes, coffee, and then that fateful item, a small, neatly wrapped chocolate bar to the British and American soldiers who packed these parcels. It was just one more ration item, standard fare in every field kit. But to these German officers, it was almost surreal. Some hesitated to eat it, as if doing so would ruin the memory of what real chocolate once tasted like. One officer, a former Luftwaffe pilot, turned the wrapper over in his hands and said quietly, "They give this to every man?" His British guard nodded. Every one of them. Standard issue. The pilot's expression didn't change, but inside a realization was beginning to form. This wasn't generosity. It was capacity, industrial, logistical, and moral. Because even as Germany struggled to feed its soldiers and civilians, the Allies were sending chocolate across oceans, not as luxury, but as routine. It was a small moment, yet it spoke louder than any speech. Here, inside a quiet prison in England, the officers were beginning to understand that the war they had once thought winnable was already lost, not on the battlefield, but in the supply lines. Before the war, Germany was a land of chocolate lovers. Cafes in Berlin and Munich displayed glass cases filled with pralines, truffles, and the famous bars of Ritter and Sarotti. Chocolate was part of daily life, a treat for children, a comfort for soldiers, a proud product of a nation known for precision and quality. But by the early years of the war, that sweetness had vanished. When Britain's naval blockade tightened around Europe, cocoa imports from West Africa stopped almost completely. What had once arrived by the shipload now trickled in through rare, costly shipments from neutral countries. By 1941, chocolate had already become scarce. By 1943, it had disappeared, in so mighteen. Its place came Ersatz-Schokolade imitation, chocolate made from roasted barley beet syrup and a powder called Kunstkakao or artificial cocoa. It looked the same, but one bite told the truth. Bitter, gritty, almost inedible. Children didn't know any better, but soldiers did. They remembered the taste of real chocolate from before the war, from Christmases past, from gifts sent home from a time when Germany still felt prosperous and proud. In letters from the front, many soldiers wrote to their families, asking if any real chocolate could be found. Few ever received it. By 1944, even ersatz versions were a rarity. Cocoa factories had been converted for chemical and weapons production. Sugar was rationed so tightly that civilian sweets nearly vanished. So when these captured officers in British hands peeled back the wrapper of an American chocolate bar, they weren't just tasting sugar and cocoa, they were tasting memory. They were tasting the comfort of peacetime, something that the amount of propaganda could replace. And beneath the propaganda, sweetness lay a bitter realization. The enemy still had the means to make and distribute luxuries even in the midst of global war. For the German officers, it was a taste that carried more than flavor. It carried humiliation. Because while Germany had turned its chocolate factories into ammunition plants, the United States had done the opposite. It had turned candy into a weapon, a symbol of morale, production, and sheer abundance. To understand why those German officers were so stunned, you have to understand what that chocolate bar really meant in the American war machine. By the late 1930s, the US Army had begun searching for a compact, high-energy food that could be carried easily by every soldier in the field. They turned to Hershey, the Pennsylvania chocolate giant that had built its reputation on sweetness and scale. In 1940, the Quartermaster Corps issued a strange challenge. They wanted a chocolate bar that could withstand high heat pack at least 600 calories and taste, in the Army's words, a little better than a boiled potato. It was meant to be eaten only in emergencies, not enjoyed. The result was the Ration D bar, dense, chalky, and hard as a brick. Soldiers joked you could break a tooth on it. It kept them alive. As the war expanded into tropical climates, Hershey developed a new version, the tropical bar, designed to resist melting in jungle heat. It was smaller, smoother, and slightly sweeter, though still far from the creamy bars. Civilians loved back home. The numbers were staggering. By 1945, Hershey had produced over 3 billion military ration bars. Their factory ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Entire trainloads of chocolate rolled out, daily destined for North Africa, Italy, the Pacific, and Europe. For soldiers, the chocolate bar became more than food. It was comfort, a reminder of home tucked into every pocket. When the fighting grew brutal, that small brown wrapper carried a kind of reassurance that no propaganda could match. It wasn't just sustenance, it was psychology, and it was mass-produced at a scale the Axis could not begin to rival. For the US military, logistics was the silent weapon. They could feed, clothe, and supply millions of men across multiple continents, and still have enough left over to include chocolate as a standard ration. To the officers in the British camp, the realization hit like a quiet thunderclap. This wasn't indulgence, it was efficiency. It meant that somewhere, across the ocean, America's factories weren't straining, they were thriving. Even in war, they could afford to sweeten every soldier's day. What happened inside those camps didn't always stay within the fences. Unknown to the prisoners, British intelligence had wired several of the officer compounds, most famously Trent Park, where hidden microphones listened to conversations around the clock. The British called it Operation Eavesdrop. They weren't just recording confessions about military operations, they wanted insight into the German mind, what captured officers really thought when they believed no one was listening. Day after day, the microphones picked up laughter, debates, despair, and sometimes astonishment. In one recording, too, Luftwaffe officers discussed the Red Cross parcels they'd received. One said, "The Americans send these things, tins of meat, cigarettes, even chocolate." For every man, his comrade replied half-jokingly, "If they have enough to give chocolate to prisoners, they must be swimming in it." The first answered quietly, "Then how can we win?" It wasn't just sarcasm. Behind that exchange lay a creeping sense of dread. These were men who had once believed in the invincibility of the Reich. Now sitting in comfort but captivity, they were confronted with the sheer scale of Allied abundance. Some officers tried to rationalize it. "The Americans waste too much," one insisted. "They'll tire before we do." But even he sounded unsure. Others fell silent, staring at the chocolate in their hands, that simple, ordinary bar that symbolized something they could no longer deny. The transcripts reveal a slow erosion of confidence. The same men who once boasted of victory at Stalingrad or superiority in aircraft design were now talking about canned food, cigarettes, and chocolate, because those not tanks or planes seemed to determine the real strength of nations. British intelligence analysts noticed the pattern. In reports sent to London, they wrote that morale among captured German officers fluctuated sharply when they were exposed to American products. It wasn't just material envy, it was psychological collapse. The more they saw of Allied abundance, the less they believed in the Reich's future, and it all started with a taste, sweet, ordinary, and utterly foreign to the hunger of wartime Europe. To the untrained eye, a chocolate bar was just another item in a soldier's kit. But to those who truly understood war, it was a quiet weapon. Because war wasn't fought only with rifles and artillery. It was fought with morale, with comfort, with the will to keep moving when everything around you screamed to stop. For the American soldier, chocolate wasn't a luxury, it was part of survival, something that reminded him of home, of family, of warmth and peace. A Hershey bar in a cold foxhole was more than calories. It was a piece of America itself. That power was no accident. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps had realized early on that morale was as crucial as ammunition. They had psychologists, nutritionists, and engineers working together to create rations that didn't just sustain the body but lifted the spirit. A simple sweet could change everything. On the front lines, soldiers often traded chocolate for favors for food or simply to thank a comrade. In liberated towns, they handed it out to children who would later remember the gesture as their first taste of freedom. Even among Allied prisoners, chocolate became a kind of currency. One bar could be traded for extra cigarettes, a pair of socks, or a favor from a guard. It was value in its purest form, morale made tangible. Now, imagine the shock for those German officers, realizing that this small square of sweetness, something their nation could no longer produce, was being handed out freely even to their captors' enemies. In Germany, civilians stood for hours in ration lines, hoping for half a loaf of bread or a handful of dried potatoes. Soldiers at the front were surviving on thin soups and ersatz coffee. Chocolate, if it appeared at all, was reserved for propaganda photos or high-ranking officials. But across the ocean, in the factories of Pennsylvania and Illinois, chocolate poured off assembly lines by the ton, feeding not just the stomachs but the spirits of millions. It was an invisible advantage, and it mattered. Because when wars drag on, men don't fight only for territory. They fight for the idea that life somewhere is still good, that what waits at home is worth returning to. For the Allies' chocolate embodied that idea. For the German officers tasting it again after years of deprivation, it was like glimpsing a world. They'd long since lost a world their nation had sacrificed to conquest and ideology, and no speech from Goebbels could erase that truth. Behind every American chocolate bar that crossed an ocean was a web of production so vast, so perfectly organized, that it almost defied belief. In 1942, while German industry struggled to replace lost oil fields and repair bombed railways, the United States was doing something unprecedented, turning its entire economy into a coordinated engine of war. The Hershey Chocolate Corporation became one small but shining cog in that massive machine. Under military contract, its Factory floor in Pennsylvania was restructured to run day and night. Conveyor belts rolled ceaselessly. Sugar milk and cocoa arrived by the trainload, and the output chocolate rations poured out faster than any confectioner in history had ever imagined possible. By 1945, Hershey's wartime output reached 3 billion bars. That's not a figure of speech. It's a literal mountain of chocolate. Enough to give every soldier, sailor, airman, and marine their own steady supply. And it wasn't just Hershey across. America companies like Kellogg, General Foods, and Nabisco all joined the war effort. Food engineers developed dehydrated meals, instant coffee, and vitamin-enriched candies. Logistics officers calculated the caloric needs of armies with mathematical precision. Ships left New York and Boston carrying crates of chocolate marked U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. They sailed through U-boat-infested waters to reach distant fronts, North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, the Pacific Islands. The bars melted in the tropical sun. Others arrived coated in frost, but the system worked. The sheer industrial rhythm of it told its own story. For every German tank built, America was producing thousands of trucks. For every Luftwaffe sortie, American factories were making bombers' bullets. And yes, chocolate. In contrast, Germany's supply system was collapsing. Trains carrying ammunition often outran their fuel supplies. Food distribution was erratic. Factories depended on forced labor and dwindling raw materials. Even as propaganda boasted of total war, the home front starved and rationed. But in the United States, a factory worker could finish her shift, buy a chocolate bar on the way home, and still send her sons overseas with one in their rucksack. That was the unspoken truth. America's strength wasn't only in weapons, but in what it could give away without hesitation. So when those captured officers in England tasted that small, unremarkable bar, they were tasting the machinery of a civilization that could afford to wage war and remain comfortable. They were tasting the industrial miracle that made defeat inevitable. Evening came softly over the camp, the November light fading into grey-blue twilight. The officers gathered in small groups near the barracks, their breath rising in, pale clouds, as they talked quietly. Dinner had been the same as always, bread, soup, and tea. But tonight, something new lingered in the air. The scent of chocolate. Some had eaten theirs immediately, savouring every bite, as if to prove it was real. Others had saved the wrapper, running their fingers over the smooth foil like it was a relic. For a few, it had stirred memories they hadn't expected to feel of birthdays, family gatherings of a time before the war consumed everything. Major Franz B., a tank officer captured in Tunisia, broke the silence first. So he said, holding up the half-finished bar, "They give this to every private?" His comrade, a naval lieutenant, nodded. "That's what the guard said." Standard ration Franz looked at it again, shaking his head slowly. "We used to say America was soft, that they didn't have the discipline for war." The lieutenant gave a faint smile. "Soft? They can make this for every soldier." "What do we make?" "Ersatz coffee and dreams." Laughter rippled briefly, but it carried no joy. The truth was too heavy. They'd all known deep down that Germany was losing. The news from the front was grim. The skies above the Reich filled with bombers, but understanding it intellectually was different from feeling it. Tonight, for the first time, they felt it. Because that little bar of chocolate wasn't about sugar or cocoa. It was a quiet, undeniable reminder of everything their country could no longer do. A few of the men began to talk about what would come next, future rebuilding, the possibility of defeat. Others stared at the horizon in silence. The war had taken their homes, their comrades, their cause. Now, a single bite of chocolate had taken their illusions, and in that silence, something shifted. All their training, their rank, their pride, they realized that the war was already over. It just hadn't been officially announced yet. Somewhere beyond those barbed wire fences, an Allied soldier sat on his cot, unwrapping the same chocolate bar, eating it casually, not realizing that halfway across the camp it had just broken a piece of the enemy's spirit, a quiet surrender, not of men but of belief, all from something that melted on the tongue. Years later, when the war was long over and the barbed wire had been cleared away, a few former officers would tell the story, not of their capture nor of their battles, but of that strange moment when they first tasted chocolate again. They would say that it wasn't the flavor itself that struck them, though it was sweet and smooth in a way they hadn't remembered, but what it represented. For them, that small, ordinary bar had carried the weight of an entire civilization. It spoke of factories that never stopped running, of railroads unbombed of ships, that never ceased to deliver. It spoke of a people who could fight a world war and still have the means to feed comfort to their men and even to their prisoners. It was the taste of stability, of abundance, of victory disguised as kindness. Historians often talk about the great turning points Stalingrad, Midway, Normandy. But sometimes, history's truest revelations happen in moments so quiet that no one writes them down. A soldier sitting behind wire, a small wrapper crinkling in his hand, the dawning understanding that his nation could no longer match what its enemies considered ordinary. That was the power of the chocolate bar. It was not a weapon, but it won a kind of battle all the same. For the captured German officers, it was a reminder of what they had. Lost not just the war, but the world they'd once believed they could dominate. For the Allies, it was a symbol of what they fought for: comfort, freedom, and the promise that even in the darkest years, sweetness could still exist. In the end, that was the quiet miracle of it all. The war would rage on, cities would burn, millions would suffer. But amid the noise somewhere in a grey English camp, a handful of defeated men discovered the simple truth of total war. The side that could give away chocolate had already stupid, won.